And welcome everybody to the Between Two Wheels podcast, episode 218. We are coming to you from Northern California. Look, we do a weekly show, which I do, to give you the news and the cycling events of the world and California, and we do interviews. Now, it's been a while since we've done some good interviews. Someone asked me on the last episode, they said, hey, what was your best interview that you enjoyed the most from 2020? Tyler Williams, Dr. Braley, Jonathan Baker, Jeff Linder, Mike Sayers, and I could say, at least as of this afternoon, this is going to be my best interview of 2021. Jason Saltzman, welcome, and how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it. All of those names are guys I grew up racing against or racing with, so happy to be amongst them.
Right, and I thought we'd talk a little bit about that. Look, you've been, actually, since you've been a junior and come on and doing any cycling, you've been kind of on high-profile teams, the Specialized team, the Bear Dev, Illuminate, a team from Austria I can't pronounce, Avello.
Don't worry, I can't particularly either still, so didn't get too much practice with that one this past year.
Why don't you give us a quick update on, first of all, who you are, in case those that don't know, and then we all want to dig back and go a little deeper into some of the growing up and the junior stuff that you've had, and obviously 2020, can't avoid talking about that, and then what you have coming up. So who are you, and how long have you been in cycling?
I'm Jason Saltzman. I grew up riding and racing in NorCal, lived there for the first, at least when I was there, for the first 22 years of my life. It's a great place to grow up, great place to race a bike. As you said, right, I spent a lot of time racing as a junior, and the first time I really raced a bike was when USAC would give me a license when I was 9, racing age 10. But even before that, I would tag along with my dad, who was also a staple in the masters racing in NorCal for a long time, and we show up to these office park crits or these downtown crits, a lot of which unfortunately don't happen anymore. And there'd be a 2-lap kids race, in the middle of the program, and I'd pin a number on and roll around for those. So I've been racing bikes for, I guess, officially for this will be 2021 will be year 14, and probably a few more years than that when you really consider it. So
that's impressive. So your dad, I do know he's a masters racer, and I imagine that's really what brought you into the sport. What was that like? I mean, was he, from the young age, you were interested in racing, and did you do any other sports, or is this kind of just the one you took to right away?
Right, I'll go one step further back. My parents actually met racing in college. I always joke that it's in the blood as much as anything else is for me. My dad was ever since I was born, well before that, my dad's been a bike racer, and the weekend activity a lot of the time was to hop in the car and tag along with him and watch him rip around a local crit. And sort of, it's one of those things where I was never forced to ride a bike. The option was certainly always there, and it was always something that I enjoyed participating in. It's one of these things where even to the day I ride with my dad, and that fosters and has fostered an incredible connection there that I really cherish. And I was a multi-sport kid in a sense, right? I did soccer and karate, and despite the fact that I'm still only 5'5.5" or 5'6", I've spent 2 or 3 years playing middle school basketball. But it was really, by the time I got to being 14, 15, 16, starting into high school, and certainly once I was a freshman or sophomore in high school, the only thing I was really focused on was racing my bike. So, I did have some multi-sport experience, but didn't last long.
It's always interesting, look, Americans, we have so many other sports that we can look to, right? And so the fact that you gravitated towards cycling is awesome. We all have, the ones that are probably watching this. So I have 4 kids, and I can't get them excited about it. You've been doing this a long time. What was kind of the key to catching that interest and getting you going, for those out there that are trying to help grow the sport and to get juniors involved? What was a key thing that did it, besides, and maybe it's just your relationship with your dad, I don't know, or mom?
I mean, I think you certainly can't undermine that at all. But, the bike's this beautiful thing, probably, more so than any other sport, right? You get to sort of get out and be out in the world on your own in a way that sort of not only lets you explore, but almost forces you to explore, right? Even when I was growing up back in the good old days, right? The ability to download routes onto Garmin's and whatnot, yeah, you could do it. And, I certainly just got a lot of routes hand fed to me from my dad and the other people in the Bay Area around me. But, you go out after school on a Tuesday afternoon and you got an hour to roll around, and all of a sudden you're going up some road that goes nowhere or turns to dirt, or, you're weaving through the residential area, trying not to, playing a game, trying not to overlap roads or whatever else, right? It's really sort of just this way to see what's around you and, at the same time, test yourself, right? I think one of the things I loved then and love to the day is the ability to sort of go out and just, see what I'm made of, in a sense, right? What I'm capable of.
Right. That adventure thing is so perfect. Now, so let me ask you this, because I've seen it kind of a trend with younger kids. Did you get your driver's license when you turned 16, or did you wait a little bit?
Immediately, day of.
Okay. Maybe that has to go with your sense of adventure and just willing to go out. Cause I'm seeing way too many kids. It seems like they're just waiting. And maybe the fact that, I was with you, the bike was immense freedom, and then the car was even more. So I'm just curious about how that went.
I think part of that is, right. There's some running joke about cyclists having a need for speed, and, the cyclists inherently, at least bike racers, being inherently better drivers. You can navigate your way through a crit at, shoulder to shoulder. You're probably a little bit more attuned to driving yourself through traffic and whatnot. But even from a logistical standpoint, right, when, a lot of the races in NorCal, you have to drive 2.5 or 3 or whatever,
right,
however many hours to get out to them. And, that was a great way to, so long as I got my permit when I was 15.5 and then my license when I was 16, right, that gave my dad a break in one direction, gave me plenty of time to practice, right? Certainly it's something I enjoy, I enjoy driving still, right? Be it down the highway to go somewhere, or, out on some of the mountain roads where I probably shouldn't admit to how fast I'm going. Nonetheless, it's this thing that really, as you said, allows for freedom and exploration just as much as the bike does.
Just one point I've noticed, and this is another, I have all kinds of theories. One is juniors you get a junior that's really qualified, really good. Maybe they're racing the Cat 1-2s. I've thought that since they hadn't been driving yet, they would just take a left-hand turn in the pack because they weren't always aware of the spatial stuff around them. Theory, we confirm that and deny it? What do you think? I know you're not a junior anymore, but you've spent a lot of time.
I'm not sure I can reach that far back and really think about it, right? What I will say is I'll give you an anecdote from various team camps where we've gone go-karting. And there's a certain level of balls to the wall, driving those go-karts around when it's a bunch of cyclists that is unmatched with any other group of people that I've gone out and gone go-karting with. So, that might not answer the question, but it certainly,
it makes sense.
Give some evidence there.
Right. Back to your junior racing. So you start off really young, and, I've seen when I was out racing in Colorado, I think it was Blake Caldwell, he used to be a pro. He had a national championship jersey from like age, 5 on up. And have you acquired, I know you got a few state championships. How about national championships, and how close have you been on that?
I've been in, the top 10 a handful of times as a junior. Never, I was not, despite the fact that I got into the sport really early and have stayed in the sport for, what now makes for a long time, I was not the superstar junior as a 10, 12-year-old or a 13, 14-year-old, right? I'm still a small guy. I was definitely a really small kid, not underdeveloped, but just underpowered relative to some of the guys I grew up racing as, right? I grew up, and it happens to with every generation, but, I grew up and there were guys who were 13-year-olds who were 5'11", 6 feet tall and
right.
had the hair on their face. Right. And I just wasn't that kid. Right. I certainly got, my fair share of had my fair share of races, probably for at least the first 4 or 5 years of my bike racing career, where I was, either getting dropped or I was just pack fill. Right. And a lot of that is, I really look at as a benefit now, right? Because I didn't just show up and have the raw horsepower to ride off the front of these races, or just ride myself onto the front of these races. I really had to learn a lot of the tactical racecraft, being smart about it, sort of things that once puberty really hit and once power started to come up and develop, and, still fingers crossed continues to come up and develop more, really has been a lot of the reason I think I've stayed in the sport for so long is, unlike a lot of those guys who basically started here as far, from a physical level, and then all of a sudden when everyone else came up to them, didn't have the tactical skills to go head to head, right? Then they just got frustrated. It was sort of the opposite. I banged my head against the wall and learned the tactical skills for a young age. And then, when the power came up to match the tactical skills, that was when things started getting better and more interesting, and, continue to be that way.
That's another one. I have all these theories. And one of them is when you see the young kid, either the junior or the initial kid that comes in there, and they immediately blow through all the categories, and then they get a chance to ride for a good team, they're not necessarily prepared to be that teammate because they've never had to really do that. Everything's just kind of come to them. So, working away and having to pay your dues as it is probably treating you well, servicing you well. Let's talk about last year as well. You got a chance to race, and I'll mix all this stuff in here. But you got a chance to race with this Austrian team and go to Europe. So when did you quit? When did you leave Avelo to go, or no, you just recently with them? Why don't you give us a breakdown of when you turned pro and the teams you've had there?
So, right, my junior career, I'll categorize sort of in, I guess it's probably best categorized in 3 parts, right? I started off and was riding basically in a kid-sized jersey of whatever team my dad was riding for, until I was going to be racing age 14, or racing age 15, somewhere in there, right? And then I did 3 years with the specialized juniors team. So my 15 and 16 and 17-year-old year, and then I moved away from that program in 2015 for my final year as a junior onto the Bear team. And then from there, in my last 2 years as a junior, right, I did far more racing in the local NorCal P12 races than I did in any junior races. I probably did 5 to 8 junior races a year, being the big marquee selection races or nationals that were earmarked by USA Cycling. But the majority of my calendar was as a, local elite racer, despite the fact that I was still on junior gears. And then certainly in 2015, my last year as a junior on Bear, I started knocking on, I was a Cat 1 by the time in my last year as a junior. Actually, maybe I was a Cat 1 by the end of my second to last year, but that's sort of neither here nor there. And, I certainly in 2015 started knocking on the door of all these big results. I was winning or podiuming at a bunch of the hardest, NorCal P12 races, which at the time were also the hardest local P12 races anywhere in the country. Right. As evidenced by the fact that in 2015, when nationals were in Tahoe, I think you had 6 or 7 guys in the top 10 for the road race, in the elite race, that were NorCal riders, right? Being the Mike's Bikes guys and the what was then the Mark Pro Strava team. And so, it certainly was holding my own, at least at the P12 level. And then for 2016, got the opportunity to ride for Team Illuminate, which was, I think technically when I always get confused by the classification of what actually counts as a pro, right? Whether, some people count Conti level pro as a pro. Some people say pro is pro Conti and World Tour. That's a debate that I don't know the proper nomenclature for. But that was my first year racing pro level races consistently. And, I had a bunch of good experiences on there, but some of the organization made it a little bit harder to really feel like I was getting everything out of myself. And then at the end of, so that was 2016, at the end of the 2016 season, right. And for most of the 2016 season, I was either a high school senior still, or, summer break. At the end of the 2016 season, I went down and started college. And luckily, a few weeks into college, got a call from Mike Creed, who was starting the Avolo team, and got offered a spot there for 2017. Like some people do, I went to college and got a little bit complacent, enjoyed being a college freshman a little bit.
Right.
And that didn't set me up as well as it could have for the 2017 season. And I still, even in the spring of 2017, I decided that I was going to keep doing the full academic course load. And that certainly didn't help, right? Because, I sort of ended up, I missed a bunch of school for team camps and racing. And even when I was at school, right, I felt like I was doing 80% of the school stuff and 80% of the riding stuff and 100% of nothing. And, it just didn't leave me particularly fulfilled on either side. And then, by the time we got later into the year and I, into the summer months, and I, basically I had to dig myself out of the hole of, build up the fitness that wasn't there in the spring and get ready for the summer racing. And, it was sort of neither here nor there, right? I was finding my legs sort of right when racing was finishing up, and, then went off to school again in the fall of 2017, knowing that, I was going to choose to take the spring of, the next spring semester, spring of 2018 off to focus on racing, right? Because it just hadn't worked particularly well.
Where were you going to school? Sorry. Where were you going to?
Claremont McKenna.
Okay.
It's a small liberal arts school that happens to be located, right? I can literally go out of my dorm room when I'm on campus and climb for an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes straight up Mount Baldy.
Beautiful.
Lots, really scenic riding, really good terrain for training hard and whatnot. And, roads that, the Tour of California used in, pretty famous roads,
right.
Or infamous roads, as it may be. So went back to school in the fall of 2018, did the semester, had gotten offered a contract again with Avolo in the fall of 2017, had gotten offered a contract with Avolo for 2018, and, went through the off season, fall semester, thought I was building up nicely for 2018, and sort of again ran into this thing where coming out of the fall semester and into the true build phase for 2018 was maybe a little bit more complacent, right? I was training hard and I was doing everything I thought I needed to, but I think, at some level it was a focus on the wrong aspect of what was going to be important for racing, the races that we were doing, right? It was a lot of long 5.5 hour rides in the mountains without as much focus on the stuff that, really makes for racing at the front end of a field, which was the higher intensity stuff. And then, had again sort of a lackluster spring of 2018, and coming out of a big old block of racing that saw, I think, 9 days of racing in 11 days with Joe Martin, and then straight into Tour of Gila, sort of knew that something needed to change. So, took a few months and really built out, I think I did the same 7x3 minute VO2 workout. So I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's somewhere between 80 and 90 times over the course of the next 3 or 4 months. And really,
did you have a coach this whole time, or were you just doing your own thing?
So the coach for the majority of the end part of my junior career and the early part of my under 23 career was Scott Moninger, who's sort of that's quite a famous name in North American bike racing.
Right.
And met him, right. Just a little bit of the backstory on that. Met him at one of the WKO Peaks coaching group, which is who he was affiliated with at the time. Sort of training camp seminar sort of things. And, that turned into a longer relationship that was sort of 4.5, 5 years of coaching that worked really well as soon as we realized that I responded much better to a lot of this high intensity work. And, that sort of built out my power profile and fitness all around, as opposed to sort of just trying to hammer out what are hard rides, the 5-hour rides, sort of just zone 2, zone 3 all day. But that's not exactly what gave me the kick in the pants that I really needed. So by the time moving back to the middle of the year in 2018, sort of knew I was on the cusp of making the teams for Tour of Utah and Tour of Colorado, and went to altitude, did all this stuff to get prepared for that, and ended up as first, despite the fact that I was finally, after however many of these VO2 workouts and however much time at altitude, I was finally in the place where I should have been earlier in the year. And I think I really do believe that I was in the place where at that point I was the fittest I'd ever been, and deserving of a spot on at least one of those teams. I ended up as first reserve for both of those races, and that was sort of what I'll call the beginning of the end of my Avolo tenure. Right, I was not offered a contract back for 2019, but also knew that the way, at the same time, I could watch the direction that US racing was trending for 2019, and I knew that sort of if I wanted to keep kicking myself in the pants to keep moving my development as a rider and racer along, right, I wanted to end up in Europe. So I spent a lot of time, emailing as many teams as you can imagine, trying to find a spot for 2019, and eventually ended up on this British registered Italian based under 23 team for 2019, and moved over there early in, I guess we had 2 months in Spain for training camp at the beginning of 2019, and then another 7.5 months or so of racing in Italy before I came back in late August. And that, that was really eye-opening, both at the level of racing in Europe is its own special beast, but it's also was eye-opening in the sense that, I became much more confident that I was knocking on the door, or, I belonged at the front end of those races, right? And I belonged in a peloton with the best under 23s in the world, who would then go on to be, the best bike riders in the world,
right?
In the next year or two. Again, sort of a fun number I look at is, I think in 2019, there were 44 or 45 guys I raced against all year who ended up on Pro Conti or World Tour teams the next year. Right. And, I wasn't beating all of those guys consistently, but there were certainly days where I finished in front of plenty of those guys. And, that was really the confidence boost, or the check on my fitness and racecraft and all the things that, had accumulated all over however many years of trying to find my place in the sport, and really gave me the confidence that, knowing what I want to do for training and knowing how to position myself in a European bike race and how to save energy and how to race well and efficiently, and, not just try to brute force it, which is very hard to do in a European bike race.
Let me just interrupt. Just so, even going back though, nationals up in Truckee, when we had them in here, and you were just a junior. I mean, you probably didn't realize at the time, but you look at who did really well in your field, from what I can remember. I mean, Carpenter, McNulty. I mean, it's kind of just smattered of an amazing amount of guys who are doing well right now, just in the top 10. And you did what, 9th or 10th? I'm trying to remember. I looked up.
I think I was 9th.
In the time trial, yeah.
I was 9th in the road race.
Road race, sorry. Well, that was an impressive road race then.
Yeah, and that's one of those days where we all have days we want slight do-overs on what happened in the race, right? The hats off to the hot tubes guys, but that race basically, you started up at the North Star Resort and you dropped down all the way down towards the Loyalton, Sierraville, whatever it is, right? All the way down. It was basically 50K downhill from the start, and no one was particularly worried about it. And the hot tubes guys got 10 or 15 guys up the road, and got the gap big enough while everyone was sitting around looking at each other. That those were the guys who won. Were the podium. Came out of that break, despite the fact that it was then 50K uphill, after a short flat lap, it was 50K uphill basically to the finish. But as you said, when you look at the guys there were 3 of us that made it into the top 10 that came out of the field. Adrian Costa ended up 4th. And then I ended up 9th, and Brandon McNulty ended up 10th, right? If I'm remembering correctly, right? And again, you look at the names that were up there, and you look at what Adrian then went on to do as an under 23 before he decided to get on with life in a sense. And you look at where McNulty is now, and that was sort of the high horsepower of American bike racing at that point.
Oh, definitely. So keep going. So let's finish this off. So you end up in Europe, which I think is a great idea. Now, is Wildlife Generation planning on going back? I'd seen that they were going to start in Turkey. That's who, spoiler, that's who you've signed with for this next year. Are they planning on going and racing much in Europe then?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, right, as you said, our current plan is to head over to Turkey at the beginning of February. Fingers crossed that actually becomes something that stays something that we can do, right? It seems to be, we seem to have Zoom calls every week to update on what's going on there. And, but yeah, I think we're going to head over, and, there'll be some European racing. There'll be a lot of racing in sort of in Turkey, Greece, Japan, potentially Thailand, potentially Rwanda, South Africa, and then all of that's before, in theory, bike racing starts again in the US in, the June, July timeframe. Hopefully once whoever wants to get vaccinated can get vaccinated, and we're back to some semblance of normal life here.
How did you get on the wildlife team? You raced, you said a conglomeration of different teams over there, the British registered team and then the Austrian team. How did you end up connecting with the Wildlife Generation, especially with not being able to do much in 2020?
So, right, it's one of these things where it's a bit of a hustle to try to figure out. When, especially in a year where there's not results and you can't just point to a race CV and say, hey, look at how good I did here. And that becomes the talking point. I sent probably 50 or 60 emails to different teams, at the end of 2020, once I had come back from Austria and knew that, that team that I was on in Austria wasn't an option for 2021 because it had gone bankrupt and basically it had disbanded by the time I was leaving Austria. And, it's one of those things where, luckily Danny Van Hout, who's the director at Wildlife, saw something in past race results from 2019 or earlier. And, I sent a bunch of sort of lab data and training data, and, was able to point at, basically I came back from Austria in August and then went on a sort of rampage of sorts, trying to, my parents moved down to Santa Barbara, and that's where I am currently, trying to set all of my best times and what ended up being a lot of Strava KOMs on a bunch of the roads down here, but that translated into a bunch of power PRs and whatnot. And, I think that, I told a pretty good story with that of, how I stayed focused throughout a really challenging 2020 and, was really keen on building towards, showing what I'd accumulated as far as fitness and knowledge over all these years now, with that confidence coming forward from 2019 that I'd mentioned, right? Knowing that I could hold my own at the front end of, these hard European under 23 and sort of under 23 elite UCI races. So
how did you manage 2020? Last year, were you over in Austria most of the time? Did you come back home? And then just mentally, how did you handle not knowing what was going on? I know a lot of riders, in the World Tour, they said, I think Dombrowski was saying that it was kind of unique where once you got kind of over the fact that you're going to train, everyone was focused for it. So that everyone just came in super hot. And he said, I think he was mentioning that you didn't really need to do the training, at least in a COVID type of year, that you normally did where it's so much base and everything else. It was just like you had mentioned, a lot of high intensity. But how did you mentally take care of all that?
So it was this really interesting thing, right? I left for Austria February. I left on Valentine's Day, right? So I got over there and had, I had a few days before we headed to Croatia for a small team camp, then for about a week. And then we came back to Austria for a week and a half or 2 weeks, and then went back down to Croatia for the first set of races. And that put us into early March, which is sort of when the world was beginning to teeter on the edge of shutting down, at least.
Right.
And we got there were two one-day races, and then what was supposed to be a 4-day stage race down in Croatia. And we got the first 2 one-day races in, and then there were, the second one of those was on Sunday, and there were 3 or 4 days before the stage race started midweek, running into the next weekend. And some of my team, right, Europe is much smaller than the US. It takes less time to get from Croatia to Austria than it does for me to get back to NorCal from Santa Barbara. So some of my teammates went home for those few days between the 1 days and the stage race, and I stayed down in Croatia with another teammate. And then everyone came back down on Wednesday for the race that started on Thursday. And within, the guys who were coming back down from Austria showed up at 3:30 in the afternoon on that Wednesday. They pulled their bikes and their bags out of the car. And by the time we got to them being unpacked, the DS had said that, things were going off in the WhatsApp group for all the, for the race and the directors and the organization, that the race was, no managers meeting that was supposed to happen at 4:30. The race was canceled. We're talking within 24 hours of when the race was supposed to start. And then the question became, okay, so, what now? We're all here. We're all in Croatia. Like, life still seems pretty normal besides the fact that they just canceled this bike race that we were all planning on doing starting tomorrow. And it became this thing where the two options were, okay, you guys just drove 6 hours down to, get here. Do you really want to throw everything back in the car or in the van and drive back to Austria tonight? Or do we want to stay here in the hotel where we already have the rooms and whatnot and drive back in the morning? And someone made the decision that they'd rather just drive, hop back, throw everything back in the van and drive back. and we're, leaving this hotel at 5:15, 5:20, and we get to the border of Croatia and Slovenia. And this is despite both of the countries being in the EU, Croatia is not a Schengen country. So that means there's real, true, border control, customs, whatnot to get back into Slovenia. We went through customs into Slovenia at 5:45. And by the time we got through customs and someone looked at their phone when we were 10 minutes down the road in Slovenia, someone saw on the news, border with Croatia and Slovenia closed until further notice, right? At 6 p.m. So we made it by 15 minutes. And otherwise, who knows what would have happened, how long we would have had to stay in Croatia, how long everything would have been shut down, and what sort of mess that would have been. But basically, we got back, and, then more and more races started getting canceled, and it became this thing of, well, sort of, okay, what now, right? Do I stay here, right? There was already this sort of max exodus of a bunch of the US, at least the World Tour riders who were all based in Europe, going home because they knew with more certainty, at least, that all of their racing was canceled until at least, at that point, it was at least May, and then it became at least June, and then it became at least July. But for us, racing at the Conti level, right, we never really got as much clarity on it. And I sort of knew that if I came home in April, right, the odds that I was going to be able to go back were very low, right? So I figured it was better to stay there and stick it out, right? My day-to-day life.
Were they still paying you, or I don't know, or what your contract was, but okay.
No, this was one of these fun salary-less Conti contracts.
Yes.
But really what it came down to is, I sort of asked myself, well, if I go home, what's my day-to-day life going to look like, right? I'm going to wake up, I'm going to eat some breakfast, I'm going to ride my bike, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to sit on the couch. Okay, if I stay in Austria, what's my life going to look like? I'm going to wake up, I'm going to eat breakfast, I'm going to ride my bike, and then I'm going to come back and sit on the couch. And at that point, and that it stayed this way all the way until I came back in August. The riding where I was in Austria was incredible. It was a very relaxed pace of life in a small town where, yes, there were still COVID concerns, but nowhere near as much as, Southern California COVID concerns. So I decided to stay over there, and the team was telling me, okay, there's racing, as soon as there's racing, we're going. As soon as there's racing, we're going. And right, that looked like it was first going to be June, and then it was going to be July, and then, who knew when that was going to come. But we got to late June, and we got, a few time trials and hill climbs and whatnot. So, everything looked like it was still moving forward, and I'd managed to, I think, we touched on this at the beginning, but I love riding my bike, right? I love training.
Yeah.
No one has to tell me to go ride my bike any day of the week. People have, my coach has to tell me not to go ride my bike on the days I'm not supposed to go ride my bike. So, that's never really been an issue, and that certainly wasn't an issue at all throughout 2020, right? I was plenty happy to go out and do, long rides for the sake of long rides, intervals for the sake of intervals, right? It really, didn't much matter to me. And, my coach and I took the chance to make it really focus on keeping something consistent, right? Keeping focused and building, even if I wasn't going to race as much in 2020, we were going to make sure that, we were doing work that moved me forward towards 2021 and whatever came next. Right. And, always with the idea that, racing could have come back in 2020, once we got to June or July, right? Racing could have come back, within, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Right. So, always staying within touching distance of, a few good and really high intensity workouts to put a finer edge on things, and then be race ready. Because, like you said, once we, it was really clear that once racing started, if you weren't ready, you weren't going to have so many shots to,
right.
get yourself ready and get yourself in the right space to make the most of those.
Did you do any virtual racing or, Zwift or any of that kind of stuff? Or you just,
no,
you were able to go outside every day?
I mean, luckily Austria was one of the European countries that never shut down so aggressively that you weren't allowed to leave your house to go train. And, had I been in Italy like I was in 2019, that was certainly the case, right? A bunch of my teammates from 2019 got stuck on top of Mount Etna for 3 months, which was certainly, I was lucky enough that I could still walk to the grocery store and go out on 5-hour rides. And if I was wearing a mask and, taking the proper precautions, if I needed to, I could hop into a gas station and fill water bottles and whatever else, right? So, I happened to luck out in that sense on, what was available to me. And, certainly if I wasn't allowed to leave the house, I would have made a whole bunch of different choices on staying there or, what I was doing for that middle part of 2020.
So did you end up racing at all in after COVID and you kind of come back? Did they even have you do any racing?
So again, right, the whole time throughout, the middle of the year for COVID, we kept getting told, as soon as there's racing, we're going, right? And that started off being some of these time trials and hill climbs. And, then we were looking at some of the, what I'll call local or, adjacent country UCI racing. And we got one race day in after the one UCI race day in after the lockdown in Slovenia at GP Kron, which is, sort of to put it in NorCal terms, it's sort of somewhere between, it's like Santa Cruz Crit, but if you made the lap really long.
Oh, okay.
But so we got one race day in, and then all of a sudden it became clear that all the best laid plans for all the racing we were going to do required way more funding than the team had at this point. The team had really suffered from the COVID stuff. Basically, as far as I understood it, the team was really sort of just bankrolled by this one rich guy, or, these two rich guys, and their personal wealth had taken a bit of a hit in the economic downturn from COVID. And, they were having financial struggles there. And that meant there wasn't money to pay for us to A, get to these races, and B, get to these races under the new UCI guidelines for all the precautions and testing and whatnot. So, at this point we're into late July and early August, and it's clear to me that, well, all the racing that I was told I was going to do once racing started again wasn't exactly happening. And, at that point, we were coming up on the start of the fall semester for school and this question of, all right, well, if there's no racing, I've sort of been in Austria not racing my bike for 6.5 months now. I should probably come home, right? It's not like I'm getting anything from staying over here at this point. So, came home at the end of 2020, not bummed, not dejected, not any of the, sort of negative connotations looking at my year. When I sort of looked at it in the sense of, what would it have been like if I was in the US, right? And if I was in the US, there would have been none of the time trials, none of the hill climbs. I wouldn't have gotten that one UCI race day. I would have, honestly probably been in stricter lockdowns at some points here than I was in Austria, right? I wouldn't have gotten to explore a beautiful place, that I'd, no one really goes to or thinks of as a great cycling destination, but is, despite the fact that I've spent time in Spain, Italy, France, various parts of the US, right? Probably still tops where I was in Austria, tops the list of places that I've ridden a bike. So, I was happy enough coming back, right? It's given the situation, I sort of was looking at the positives instead of dwelling on the fact that, oh man, I went over there and I moved halfway across the world and didn't get to do what I wanted to, or at least what I went there to do.
And look, if you're going back, I mean, some of this shows, I remember back in my day, some riders, Chris Horner as an example, went over there when he first signed with FDJ, and he came back. He had trouble with the language, all kinds of things, and life is obviously much different now, that your ability to communicate back home and with everybody. But I mean, it shows that your comfort level was to such that you're okay to, even during isolation, you're being over there. So kudos for you. And it's only going to help you, imagine, in the future. So I have a question about your team. So, there was something that came about, and I'm not going to have you comment on this exact issue, but Quinn Simmons gets in a little trouble. Chloe Dygert gets in a little trouble. And I'm just curious as to your progression up with junior racing, and then some of the, the teams you've been with. Do they do any kind of help as far as like, hey, perhaps here's how you're going to stay out of trouble, with the public or with social media the way it is now? Is there any training that goes along with that? And, from your junior days, you might have had a little bit more help with your parents, and I don't know if it was such a big deal, but what's kind of your thought on that, or what are your insights?
It's interesting, right? Because I think, there's a lot of the stuff that happened on, we'll take the Specialized team or the Bear team or a Volo, right? Which were all development teams in some form or another, right?
Right.
And there was, all of those teams had people behind them that clearly, it wasn't so much focused on social media, but it was focused on, hey, you can't get through this world being blind to everything around you, right? You really have to think about what you're doing and saying and how you're representing yourself. None of it, I think, was as explicit. And I think at a certain level, none of it, right, even still, when I think about the difference between how connected everyone is in 2021 versus how connected everyone was in 2015, right? Social media has certainly evolved, right? And has become more and more ever present in the way that athletes and brands and, whoever else interact and share their opinions and their, share their voices. And I think, certainly I would imagine, right, that there's a lot more coaching or help, or I don't know what, to moral and ethical training that goes into, athlete development, regardless of the sport. But, I would hope it carries over to cycling as well.
Right. And maybe you're down in Southern California. I was going to ask you if you've seen Chris Froome down there, but when you see him talk, you can tell it's very corporate. That Ineos has probably really spent a lot of money in how these guys are going to maintain themselves in the press, which is obviously a little different than what your situation is. But it all comes around and goes around. So, and have you seen Froome down there since I guess he's training in SoCal? I
mean, he's in Malibu and I'm in Santa Barbara, and under the current California shelter-in-place order, I'm not going down to Malibu right now. So no, I haven't seen him out and about, but I certainly see, right, there are plenty of people that I know well and have spent a lot of time racing and training with that live down in that area, that you get the flyby pictures of Froome saying,
yeah,
oh wow, look at that, right? Or whatever else.
You had also mentioned earlier that you saw kind of a progression of where USA Cycling was going. Maybe comment a little bit on what you think that is, and if there's any coming back from it. And maybe I don't even understand what you're implying.
No, I think right in what you're implying by there's a coming back from it is certainly what I was alluding to, right? Okay. When I look at where what I'll call local racing, right? Cat 3, P1-2 racing, local juniors racing was when I was a junior, and really I think the beginning of the end of the really high-powered, local racing efforts coincided with the end of my time as a junior. But I think about all the guys I grew up racing against as a junior, right? Being guys who have gone on to World Tour racing or Pro Conti racing, or at least went on to be really good under 23s. Some names we already mentioned, as Adrian Costa or Brandon McNulty, or I was teammates with Nielsen Paulus for a year on Specialized. You look at all of those guys and all of the sort of simply the number of race days that were available to us then, right? It sort of seems like since 2015 or 2016, people have, rightly or wrongly, right? I make no judgment on what people want to do with how they ride their bike, right? But there's been a general trend towards more adventure, more exploration, less pin a number on and bump shoulders for a 90-minute crit or a 100-mile road race or whatever, right? It's just, maybe it's a trend away from competition in a sense towards a more inclusive sport, which I think is a great thing. Right. But I also think given the small population of people who ride a bike, for anything more than recreation in this country, it sort of happens as a, not binary, but as a trade-off between the two, right? If you have the people that used to be the Cat 4 or the Cat 3 bike racers, who would pin a number on every weekend to race their bike around a industrial park crit, now instead finding their happiest version of riding a bike, playing around on the gravel with their friends, or riding a mountain bike, or doing a fondo or whatever else, you're right. Who am I to tell them how they should enjoy riding a bike? But if they're not riding a bike, then who's paying the entry fees to help the race promoters put on all these races? And if you need bike races to be a bike racer,
right?
And that's sort of what it comes down to. What you're talking about. You won, and I just remember this, you won Nevada City Classic, which is a great, heralded race, right? Greg LeMond, all these great racers. I think, anyway, a lot of great racers have won that. I think Lance Armstrong won that, right? But when you were winning it, the field was less. And over the last few years, it's been difficult, is that race even going to be happening? And sometimes it's like, you talk about these gravel and these great adventure races, but some of these really difficult, you'll have a business park crit that'll get more racers attending it than this amazing race up in Nevada City. So maybe that's, I don't know if it's the competition. We don't want to do the hard racing or what have you, but by the way, congratulations on that race. That's one to really put on there. That's one where I certainly still hold some amount of pride in that one, however many years down the line. So,
yeah.
But yeah, no, I think more to your point, right? It's one of these things where, again, right, people are finding ways that make them happy to ride their bike. And that's a great thing. But I think it does come at a cost or a trade-off of, look, if, you don't want to compete, right. And, you don't want to go show up to a race, get dropped within the first 10K, and then roll around in a, sad state of, oh man, I got dropped, right. You can go and do a gravel race, and you can, it doesn't matter how long it takes you.
Right.
Right.
You have a feed station and get some snacks and, keep going.
Exactly. Right. You can take a handful of pretzels or a handful of M&Ms and ride at whatever pace you want with your buddies, be that fast or slow. Right. And the front end of those things now are real deal bike racing. Right. You look at the World Tour guys who are participating, or the former World Tour guys who are participating, and you look at the power files for those versus the power files for a one-day race, of any caliber. And they're just as hard, if not harder. So, right. But I think the appeal of it is that you can, right, unlike a bike race where your only option is to really put your head down and suffer and race it, right? You, in a gravel race or a fondo, right, you can put your head down and race against the guy next to you for 5 minutes, are, up this one climb or across this one segment, and then you can spend 2 hours just sitting there chatting next to him, rolling along like you would on any training ride without the pressure of, oh man, there's 20 guys up the road and I have to, if I'm not in those 20 guys, I didn't get anything out of the day.
Right. And you're going to get lapped or picked up by the sag wagon or something. Have you done any of those? And do you have any interest, or is just the road just too inviting for you?
I've never strayed very far from the road. Right, I've done a few, right, in 2018, I did a few of the Grasshopper series of events. And, I think that's probably the closest that I've come to. Right, it's certainly something that holds some appeal to me once I'm done racing my bike at whatever level that may be, right, or at least at the level that I'm currently racing. And, certainly if it could get peppered in a constructive rather than destructive way, I'd be very happy to do it. But yeah, as I said, I've never strayed particularly far from the road. If I always joke that if I can't do it on 28C road tires, maybe I shouldn't be doing it.
Are you what's your plan for finishing school? What's the timeline of that? And then kind of your projection for continuing racing?
So I've got one semester left. Okay. Starts in 10 days. So, and luckily one of the things that's been a benefit throughout this whole COVID pandemic is that, I got to, I lived at home all, and did the fall semester all fall. And instead of, partaking in some of the social activities and whatnot that really cut into a relaxed off season and, the ability to really focus a base block and, a build block into the 2021 season, right? I had none of those distractions, right? And now I'm, I feel like I'm really firing on all cylinders coming into 2021. And again, in the spring, school will be online for me, and I'll take, I'll use that and basically, finish out my college career at some point in early May. And then that gives me, certainly with the uncertainty of what racing will happen before May or June of 2021, who knows how much time I'm going to have to sort of split my focus even between at least racing and school, right? Training and school is easy enough to balance if you're always in one place with consistent Wi-Fi connection and you can sort of get into a routine. But what it really affords me is the ability to graduate in May and then have sort of freedom to, when racing will almost certainly extend into October at least of 2021, right? I'm not constrained by the fact that I have to go back to school in the fall, and it allows really this freedom to go on and pursue bike racing, whatever that might look like coming out of 2020, the 2021 season, or whatever's next coming out of the 2021 season. So
where's Wildlife Generation? Where are they based from?
Some San Diego County. I think Vista technically is where the team's based out of.
And how's the team look this year for everything? I mean, let's just always assume we're going to be able to race.
Yeah, we'll make the assumption that racing is going to happen as it gets scheduled at least. It's looking really good. Really strong 10 rider roster. Four guys returning from the 2020 team. All of whom I've spent some time racing against, one of whom I've been teammates with, all really strong guys. And then a lot of, the six of us that are coming on, we're really, Danny is bringing on a lot of horsepower, right? Guys who have ridden for the team previously and have had, a lot of success on the pro circuit, Sergei Svetkov, Johnny Clark, Ulises Castillo, are all guys who rode for the team back when it was Jelly Belly. And then, myself, Noah Granigan and Spencer Petrov, both of whom rode for the Hincapie team in 2020, are coming on board. So, from a roster standpoint, I think we have certainly one of the strongest teams in the US, and, really, it's been said multiple times in our team meetings that our goal is to be one of, if not the best Conti teams in the world this year. So, and I really think, I believe that, and everyone on the team believes that we can do that. So
before we close out here, what are your personal goals for racing this year? Domestically, if we have any, and internationally, whatever. Have you pinpointed anything specific for you, or maybe just a plan of what you want to accomplish for this year?
I mean, I think I'll give a sort of catch-all statement of, right, I want to deliver on that confidence and that I got in 2019 racing in Europe, and the now 14 or 13 or however many years it is of building this fitness, right? And, cycling's a sport that takes a long time to build up that fitness and that base to then, put the finishing touches on, right? It's a lifetime sport, right? And, that I'll extend that to beyond whatever I do in racing, right? It's something that I am almost certain I will be riding a bike in some capacity, for decades to come, right? And having built on the last 13 or 14 years, right, I really want to deliver on everything I've built, and taken all of this time and sacrifice and hard work to build up here.
Yeah, and everyone should take note, because I'm someone who, like you, was riding forever, took a few years off, gained a little weight, played a lot of golf. It's more fun, and it's easier to just stay fit that whole time. So where can people find you and follow you for the year? Either Twitter or Facebook or what have you. How can they find out and keep up with what you're going on?
I think the best places to look are Instagram at j.salt. If I could remember my Twitter handle, I'd give you my Twitter handle.
I will link it to the podcast, so everyone could just click on it as well.
Right. I'm in 2020, I wrote, and in 2021, I will be writing a blog for CyclingNews, which should come every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the time frame on what racing there actually is and what stories there are to tell. And then, following the team at Wildlife Generation Pro Cycling on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook would be a great place to look.
All right, everybody, you can find it. We'll link up to those spots, so you can end up finding Jason online, and we'll hopefully maybe try to keep up with you during the year. So I really appreciate you coming on, give us a little backstory, and good luck. And you check a look at some of his racing in NorCal, people, because he's got some stellar results here. Nevada City, must we say anything more? Cat's Hill, you've done well in there. And by the way, that's why I met your dad once, and you here at Cyclebration. So
a lot of right, going back to what we were saying about the way USAC racing is working, those are a lot of races that maybe may not happen anymore. Right.
So hopefully we'll get some racing for this year. Thank you, everybody. 218 in the books. Jason, appreciate it. We'll link up to all your stuff. And once again, keep in touch with us, and best of luck for the year.
Thank you.
Yep.